On the morning of March 26, 1991, 5 boys walked up a mountain on the edge of their city. It was a holiday. There was no school. They told their families they were going to catch salamander eggs in the hills above their neighborhood. And then they were gone. But what followed was the largest search for missing children in the history of South Korea. Hundreds of thousands of people. A president's personal order. Over 10 million flyers, and 11 years of silence. And when the mountain finally gave the boys back, it did not give back an answer. It gave back a deeper question. One that more than 30 years later has never been resolved. Did these children get lost and die on a mountain that an entire nation had searched? Or were they murdered on a hillside less than 2 miles from their homes and left there while hundreds of thousands of searchers walked right past them? This is the case of the Frog Boys. And the strangest thing about it is not that we never caught who did it. It's that the people who investigated could never even agree on what happened. To understand how strange this case is, you have to understand the day it began. March 26, 1991 was not an ordinary day in South Korea. It was a temporary national holiday. The country was holding its first local elections in 3 decades. The first since the system had been suspended after a military coup. Schools were closed. The adults were occupied with the vote, and so the children of a neighborhood in Daegu, a city in the country's southeast, were left to their own holiday. 5 boys, all from the same elementary school, set off together toward Waryong, a low wooded mountain that rose right at the edge of where they lived. Their plan was simple and ordinary, and the kind of thing children had done on that hill 100 times before. Climb a little way up and look for salamander eggs in the cool spring pools. A small note about the name. The press would later report that the boys had gone looking for frog eggs. It wasn't quite right. It was salamanders. But the mistranslation stuck, and the country would come to know them forever as the Frog Boys. They reached the foot of the mountain. They were seen there. And then 5 boys, in broad daylight, on a clear spring morning, in a neighborhood full of people, simply vanished. By nightfall, when none of them had come home, the families went out onto the hillside themselves, calling the boys' names into the dark. They did not know they had just begun a search that would outlast the decade, and they did not know the most painful part of all, that the answer was already up there, on the mountain, waiting. What happened next has almost no equal anywhere in the world. The disappearance of 5 children on a single morning struck a national nerve. Within days, it was front-page news across the country. 2 years on, the nation's biggest investigative programs devoted full episodes to it, and the response was enormous, almost unimaginably so. The president himself, Daegu, issued a special order to find the boys. Police and soldiers were poured into the search. By the official count, over the years, some 350,000 personnel. They formed lines and walked the hillsides shoulder to shoulder, a meter apart, sweeping the mountain again. And again, and again. More than 10 million flyers were printed and handed out. In a country of around 40 million people, that is roughly 1 flyer for every 4 citizens. The boys' faces went onto phone cards, postcards, even the cardboard sleeves of children's cartoon tapes. The reward climbed to 42 million won. The search became part of the texture of national life, a wound the whole country carried, year after year, that simply would not close. And for the families, the years became their own kind of torture. Every new tip, every false sighting, every rumor of a boy seen in some distant town raised hope, and then took it away again. And here is the detail that turns this from a tragedy into a genuine mystery. That mountain, Waryong, was not some vast, trackless wilderness. It was a small, familiar hill at the edge of a city, the kind of place neighborhood children played on every week. It was searched and searched and searched again by hundreds of thousands of people for months and then years, and they found nothing. No clothes, no trace. 5 boys had walked into a small wooded hill that an entire country was tearing apart looking for them, and the hill said nothing back. For 11.5 years, it would keep its silence. Years passed. The flyers faded on the walls. The boys, had they lived, would have grown from children into young men. And slowly, painfully, the case began to slip toward the place where unsolved things go to be forgotten. And then, on September 26, 2002, 11 years and 6 months after the boys disappeared, a man gathering acorns on the slope of Waryong-san found human remains. It was on the mountainside behind a high school construction site, partway up the same hill that had been searched so many times. There, investigators recovered the remains of the 5 boys and 5 pairs of their small shoes. The long wait was over. After 11.5 years, the families finally knew where their children were, but the discovery did not bring peace. Almost at once, it created a new and terrible argument, one that has never been settled. Look closely at what was found and at where. The remains of all 5 children were together, in one place, on a mountain that had been combed by hundreds of thousands of searchers for over a decade. How could they have been missed? For over a decade, on a small hill, by an entire nation? Some asked. Had the bodies been there the whole time, somehow overlooked by every sweep? Or had they been brought there later, after the frenzy of the early search had finally died down? Both answers seemed impossible. One of them had to be true. The site itself raised questions it could not answer. The boys' clothing was found knotted and bound in unusual ways, knots that were hard to explain as the work of weather, or animals, or time, and the bones themselves carried marks that would split the investigation in two, because now there were 2 groups of people looking at the same 5 children, and they were about to reach 2 completely different conclusions about how those children had died. This is the true center of the Frog Boys case. Not a villain. A contradiction. On one side stood elements of the police investigation. For much of the long search, an official line had leaned toward the gentlest possible explanation, that the boys had climbed too high, become lost or trapped on the cold mountain, and died of exposure, a tragic accident, and nothing more. It was, in a way, the most bearable story. A terrible accident asks no one to imagine a person who would do harm to 5 children. And even after the remains were found, that possibility, lost children, lost to the cold, was still put forward. On the other side stood the forensic medicine team from Kyungpook National University, who examined the remains directly, and what they found did not fit the story of children quietly freezing on a hillside. On the skulls of 3 of the boys, they identified damage, injuries that in their judgment could not be explained by exposure or by an accidental fall on a mountain. Their conclusion was blunt, and it was the opposite of the gentle one. This was homicide. These children had been killed. Sit with how strange that is. The 2 sets of people closest to the case, the investigators searching for the truth and the scientists examining the remains, could not agree on the most basic fact of all. Not who did it, not why, not how, but whether a crime had even occurred at all. If the forensic team was right, then somewhere out there was a person who killed 5 children on a quiet hill and was never caught, and who may have walked among the searchers, or read the flyers, or watched the whole country grieve. If the gentler theory was right, if it really was only an accident, then that still could not explain the bound clothing, or how 5 bodies lay undiscovered for 11 years on a small, endlessly searched hill, only to surface all at once. Every theory that has ever been offered runs aground on the same rocks. Accident cannot explain the injuries. Murder cannot easily explain how an entire nation's search missed them for over a decade. And through all of it, the most ordinary facts of a crime were never found. No weapon was ever identified. No motive. No suspect that the case could hold. The case refuses to resolve. It always has. And then, the case ran out of something even the most patient investigator cannot recover. It ran out of time. Under the law as it stood, murder carried a statute of limitations, a deadline after which, even if a killer were found and confessed, they could no longer be charged. For this case, that clock had been running since the spring of 1991. On March 25, 2006, 15 years after 5 boys walked up a mountain, that deadline passed. From that moment on, even a full confession could change nothing. Whatever happened on Waryong-san became, in the eyes of the law, permanently unanswerable. And here's the cruelest turn of all. In the years that followed, South Korea decided that murderers should not be able to outrun the clock. In 2007, it stretched the statute of limitations for murder. And in 2015, it abolished that deadline for murder entirely, but the law could only reach forward, not back. It applied to cases whose clocks had not yet run out. And the clock on the Frog Boys had stopped in 2006. The change that might have kept the case alive came just a few years too late to touch it. So the Frog Boys took their place among South Korea's great eternal unsolved cases, alongside the Hwasung serial murders and the kidnapping of a boy named Lee Hyung-ho, two of those cases the world would come to know through film. This one stayed mostly in the dark, a mystery that by law can now never officially be closed. But the boys were not forgotten. Their families held a joint funeral for them. The case changed how the country thought about missing children, about search, about evidence, about the limits of even the largest effort a nation can make. And in 2021, 30 years after that spring morning, the city placed a memorial near the mountain, a single stone that remembers the 5 boys and stands as a quiet wish for the safety of every child who ever climbs a hill to look for something small and alive in the water. So we are left with the mountain and its silence. An entire nation searched a small wooded hill for 11 years and found nothing. Then the hill gave the children back all at once, and with them an injury that science called murder, an official story that called it an accident, and not one fact in between that could make those two truths into one. We know the day they left. We know the mountain they climbed. We know at last where they were found. We do not know the one thing that matters most. What happened to them in between? 5 boys went up a mountain on a spring holiday to look for salamander eggs. The mountain kept its secret, and more than 30 years later, it is keeping it still. For the 5 boys of Waryong-san, may they finally rest in peace.